You really think you can just walk away after everything that you have done? Look at me when I speak to you. There is nowhere left for you to hide. This is where it ends for you, understand?
If you think you are walking out of this room with my children still breathing, you are going to have to put a bullet in me first, right here, in front of the incubators.
The chart hanging from the foot of incubator number 7 didn't have a name on it. It had a code, a timestamp, and one line of handwritten red ink stating that no visitors were permitted without federal clearance. The man standing over the glass had not asked for clearance. He had not waited for permission. He had not even slowed down when the night nurse at the station tried to stand up and stop him, because something about the way he moved through that doorway told her, on some animal level, that stopping him was not a thing her body was built to do. He didn't look like a father. He looked like a man who had taken a wrong turn out of a war and ended up, by some clerical error of the universe, standing in a room full of sleeping infants. His hands were the first thing that gave him away. Tae-Hyun's hands were famous, in the small and terrible circles where his name carried weight, for their absolute stillness. Men who had watched him sign death warrants and renew shipping contracts in the same unbroken hour had never once seen those hands shake. They were shaking now. He pressed one of them flat against the warm glass of the incubator, and the tremor ran all the way up through his wrist, and he didn't try to stop it, because for once in his life there was nothing in him left over to spend on controlling himself. Inside that glass box, 2 heartbeats that had existed in the world for less than 48 hours were doing the small, furious work of staying alive. This was the bloodline. This was the singular, narrow thread that an empire spanning the shipping lanes from Incheon to Vladivostok had been built, brick by brutal brick, to protect. And someone had hidden that thread in the bowels of an underfunded public hospital in Brooklyn, in a ward that smelled like bleach laid over something the bleach hadn't quite killed, under fluorescent lights that buzzed instead of glowed. The door didn't open. It was thrown. It cracked against the wall hard enough that a ceiling tile shifted in its frame, and the scuffle of rubber-soled shoes against linoleum arrived a half-second before the woman did, dragging an 4-pole beside her like a crutch she refused to admit she needed. Zaria stood in the doorway with her hospital gown stained dark at the hem, her face the color of old paper, her whole body trembling with the particular, bottomless exhaustion that comes only from giving birth without anyone holding your hand. She looked, for a moment, like something that might fall over if the wind changed. Then she opened her mouth, and there was nothing fragile in it at all. She told him to get his hands off them. She didn't shout it. She said it the way you'd say a fact, the way you'd state the boiling point of water, and the sheer flatness of it landed harder than a scream would have. Tae-Hyun didn't turn around right away. For 3 full seconds he kept his palm against the glass, eyes closed, and let her voice hit the back of his skull like something physical. When he did turn, the fury on his face had nowhere left to hide. It sat right out in the open, raw and shaking, tangled up with something that looked almost like grief. He crossed the room in 2 strides and bent down until his shadow swallowed her whole, until the gap between his face and hers was nothing, and he pointed one trembling finger at her chest and demanded, voice low, voice scraped down to something almost like a growl, to know how she could have hidden his children from him, how she could have hidden them and run. She didn't step back. She didn't look away. She looked straight up into the eyes of the most feared syndicate leader in East Asia and told him, evenly, that she hadn't run from his enemies. She told him that if he thought he was walking out of that room with her children still breathing, he was going to have to put a bullet in her first, right there, in front of the incubators, in front of God and the night nurse and whoever else was listening. What Zaria did not know, what she could not have known, standing there ready to die for 2 infants she delivered alone in a city that had never once asked her real name, was that Tae-Hyun had not come to New York for revenge. He had come because 45 minutes earlier, a single encrypted file had landed on his private server, sent from inside his own organization, carrying data that should not have existed yet. According to the genetic sequencing extracted from the hospital's own internal mainframe, one of the twins belonged to him. The other carried the DNA of his oldest, most lethal enemy. He hadn't broken down that door in cold fury at being betrayed. He had broken it down, already broken, a man walking toward the one truth he was most afraid of confirming with his own eyes. Welcome back to the channel. If your pulse just ticked up a notch, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and settle in, because the road that brought an elite American architectural designer and a tattooed Korean syndicate boss to a standoff over a falsified genetic test in a Brooklyn maternity ward did not start in that hospital. It started 2 years earlier, on a rain-slick night in Seoul, in a half-finished concrete tower that smelled like wet cement and instant coffee. And to understand how far Tae-Hyun fell and how far Zaria ran, we have to go all the way back to the beginning. Seoul does not ease a person into its rhythm. It takes you whole, the way a tide takes a shoe left too close to the waterline, and it does not particularly care whether you were ready. For Zaria, the 14th floor of the unfinished Hera Hotel was not a glamorous milestone in an international career. It was a drafty concrete shell, ribbed with exposed rebar, lit by temporary work lamps that buzzed at a frequency just high enough to give her a headache by 4 in the afternoon. She was 26 years old, and she had traded the loud, familiar warmth of Atlanta, the kind of place where people said her name correctly without being asked twice, for a city that reminded her, every single morning, that she did not belong in any room until she had spent the first 20 minutes proving she'd earned the right to be there. The local contractors mispronounced her name on the official building permits so consistently that she eventually stopped correcting them, because correcting them cost more energy than it returned. They treated her structural specifications less like binding documents and more like a foreigner's suggestions, something to be nodded at and quietly revised the moment she left the room. It was a slow, grinding kind of isolation, the sort that doesn't announce itself as loneliness because there's too much work to do to notice you're lonely, until one night you're alone in a freight elevator at 9 o'clock and you realize you haven't had an actual conversation, the unguarded kind, in 11 days. The Tuesday it happened, the rain had been falling since noon, and the boardroom on the 14th floor had the particular electric tension of a meeting where someone is about to be embarrassed and doesn't know it yet. The project director, a man whose entire professional identity rested on absolute, unquestioned deference from everyone beneath him, had just instructed his team, quietly, almost as an aside, to gut Zaria's recessed lighting specifications from the plans. It wasn't about taste. It was about a budget hole he had dug for himself months earlier and was now trying to fill with someone else's work. He expected her to fold. He expected the soft, apologetic compromise he assumed came standard with being a foreign woman half his age in a country that wasn't hers. Instead, Zaria leaned forward, set her pen down flat against the blueprint with a small, deliberate click, and told him, no raised voice, no theater, that if those specifications disappeared from the plans, her firm's safety certification disappeared along with them, and his hotel could explain that to its insurers. It wasn't a threat. It was leverage, stated as fact, the same way she might have told him the load rating on a steel beam. She had no idea that a man named Tae-Hyun was standing near the temporary freight elevator at the far end of the room, perfectly still, completely unannounced, and that he had been there long enough to watch the entire exchange unfold. In the part of Gangnam where his family's name meant something, people learned who Tae-Hyun was before they ever saw his face. His shipping empire functioned less like a company and more like a small, sovereign nation, run on a doctrine his father had carved into him since boyhood. Visibility is a vulnerability. A man who could be seen could be predicted. A man who could be predicted could be killed. He had no real reason to be standing in a mid-level design review for a hotel his holding company happened to fund, except that he had an instinct, honed over 3 decades of reading rooms for threats, for spotting the one person in a space who could not be bought, bullied, or quietly absorbed into the wallpaper. He watched the stubborn, unhurried focus in Zaria's eyes as the director tried to speak over her, and something in him filed her away as a category of person he rarely encountered. He did not make an entrance. He simply walked to the table, ignoring the sudden cascade of low bows from the local staff who recognized him, and said one short, precise sentence in Korean directly into the director's ear. Whatever the sentence was, the man's face lost its color in real time. Within 3 minutes, the meeting had ended. The lighting budget had been fully restored without a single further word of debate, and Zaria was left standing alone in a room that had, for reasons she didn't yet understand, suddenly bent itself entirely around her. By the time she turned to find whoever had tipped the room in her favor, there was nothing left to find. A heavy wool coat disappearing through the stairwell door. That was all. Their marriage happened fast, 6 months later, conducted almost entirely out of view of the society press that would have devoured it. Tae-Hyun did not court her with the loud, performative gestures men in his position usually reached for. No public proposals, no jewelry chosen to be photographed. He showed affection the only way he seemed to know how, through a hypervigilant, almost frightening attention to detail. He knew, without being told, exactly how many consecutive hours she could work before her shoulders started to round forward with fatigue. He quietly bought out the lease on her favorite noodle shop near the studio, not to own it, but simply to make certain it would still be open on the nights she worked past midnight. For a woman who had spent her entire adult life fighting for a single inch of professional respect in rooms that didn't want to give it to her, that kind of attention felt, at first, like the first quiet room she'd ever been allowed to rest in. But a man who has spent his whole life building walls to keep danger out will, eventually, lock himself inside them, and anyone he loves right along with him. The first hairline crack in the illusion showed up on an unremarkable Thursday evening. Zaria noticed a black sedan parked at the curb outside her studio, engine running, no plates on the front bumper. She mentioned it over dinner the way you'd mention any small strange thing, half a joke, half a question. Tae-Hyun's face went completely, instantly blank. It wasn't boredom. It was a reflex, something installed in him as a child, when a strange car parked outside the house meant someone was about to die. He didn't discuss it with her. He didn't ask what she thought, or what she wanted, or whether she'd be comfortable with what came next. The following morning, she arrived at her studio to find 6 men in dark suits stationed at the entrance like furniture that had always been there. Her small, battered compact car, the one she'd actually liked driving, had been replaced overnight with an armored SUV, windows rated to stop a rifle round. Her daily routes to job sites were now pre-mapped by his security team, and any deviation required a confirming text message, as though she were a shipment that needed tracking. When she confronted him, voice tight, asking what exactly he thought he was doing to her life, Tae-Hyun looked at her with a stillness that had no give in it anywhere. He told her his job was to keep her breathing, not to make her feel free. He meant it as a declaration of love. It landed on her like the description of a cage. The breaking point, the real one, the one that didn't leave room for another conversation, came on their first anniversary. Tae-Hyun was stuck at the Incheon port handling a labor dispute that had turned ugly enough that he wouldn't tell her any of the details, only that he'd be late. Alone in the high, silent penthouse that night, surrounded by glass and steel, and not one single sound that wasn't manufactured by the building's own climate system, Zaria felt a wave of claustrophobia close over her so completely that she had to get up and move, just to prove to her own body that she still could. She went looking for a set of charcoal pencils she'd left in his home office weeks earlier. While digging through the lower cabinet of his desk, her fingers caught on a small, unfinished wooden lip beneath the main drawer, a seam that shouldn't have been there, the kind of detail her architect's eye registered before her conscious mind even caught up. It gave way with a soft click. A hidden compartment slid open, and inside it sat a thick, unlabeled manila folder. She opened it under the dim glow of the desk lamp, and her own face looked back up at her from a stack of photographs. It wasn't a casual background check. It was an exhaustive, multi-year surveillance file. Candid photos of her walking to class at Georgia Tech, copies of childhood dental records, a full financial history of her mother's bank accounts, a family tree stretching back 60 years, mapped out in a level of detail that made her stomach drop before her mind had even finished reading the dates. The oldest documents in the file were time-stamped 2 full years before she had ever applied for a visa to set foot in South Korea. The room seemed to lose all its air at once. The chance meeting at the hotel. The way he'd appeared out of nowhere to defend her in that boardroom. The sudden, intense interest in her life, her habits, her exhaustion thresholds. None of it had been chance, and none of it, she now understood with a clarity that felt like falling, had ever really been love in the way she believed. She had been identified, analyzed, acquired, in the same patient, methodical way his company acquired shipping routes and rival ports. She wasn't his partner. She was an asset that had been moved into position. And when she looked up and found the small, unblinking eye of a security camera in the corner of the ceiling, she understood, with total and immediate certainty, that she had to be gone before whatever trap this was finished closing around her. Leaving a man who personally owns the digital nervous system of an entire city is not something you can do by thinking like a frightened wife. You have to stop thinking like a person who exists inside modern infrastructure at all, and start thinking like something the infrastructure was never built to track. Zaria understood, with the cold clarity of someone who had spent her career analyzing where buildings fail under stress, that the moment she used a credit card, logged into a personal email account, or even walked past a high-resolution traffic camera anywhere in Gangnam, a silent alert would land on Tae-Hyun's private server before she'd finished crossing the street. She had spent years studying blueprints for the precise points where a structure gives way. Now she needed to find those same points in her husband's surveillance machine, and she needed to find them without him noticing she was looking. So for 3 full weeks, she did absolutely nothing. She went to her design meetings. She sat through dinners in a dining room, so quiet it felt like being underwater. She let his security team drive her along the same pre-approved routes, day after day, without complaint. But every evening, hunched over what looked like ordinary hotel layout sketches, she was actually memorizing the real architecture of the penthouse, the load-bearing walls, the service corridors, the places where a building's blueprints and its lived-in reality quietly diverge. Eventually she found it, a service elevator meant for industrial maintenance, the kind of unglamorous infrastructure that security contractors design buildings around, but rarely bother to secure themselves, because who bothers to escape through a freight elevator? It bypassed the lobby's biometric scanners entirely and led out into a blind alley behind a fish market 2 streets over. On a rainy Thursday night, with Tae-Hyun pinned down at a shipyard in Busan, dealing with a customs audit that had appeared out of nowhere and would keep him there until morning, Zaria made her move. She didn't pack a suitcase. She didn't touch the jewelry he'd given her, didn't take a single thing that could be traced or pawned or recognized. She filled one canvas backpack with her actual identification documents, her charcoal pencils, and a change of dark clothing, and she set her wedding ring down in the exact center of the glass dining table, on top of a set of divorce papers she had drafted herself and never told him about. She didn't take a taxi to Incheon Airport, because a taxi meant a record, a camera, a trail. She walked 3 miles through a freezing downpour to a wholesale flower market on the edge of the city, where she met a small, loose network of expat women, designers, teachers, small business owners she'd quietly helped over the years with pro bono renovation work, asking nothing in return except their discretion. None of them asked her a single question that night. They simply pooled cash and arranged a long-haul cargo truck heading south to the port town of Yosu, a route that sidestepped every high-speed rail line, where Tae-Hyun's facial recognition contracts ran around the clock. When Tae-Hyun returned to the penthouse 48 hours later, the quiet in the apartment was a different kind of quiet than the one he'd built it for. It wasn't controlled. It was empty. He stood over the glass table for a long time, looking down at the ring and the papers, and his face did not twist into the rage anyone who knew him might have expected. His jaw simply set, slow and final, into a line that didn't move. He picked up his phone and called his logistical manager, and the order he gave was 2 words long. Find her. For 8 months, his global tracking network returned exactly nothing. His own technical team called it, in private, a mathematical impossibility. Zaria had not crossed a single international border under her legal name, had not touched a passport, had not so much as appeared on a single piece of recorded footage anywhere his systems had eyes. She had gone somewhere his money and his reach apparently could not follow, and that fact alone unsettled him more than any act of open defiance could have. She was alive in an unmapped basement apartment in Brooklyn, taking cash-only work, drafting interior layouts for small, unregistered businesses that didn't ask why a clearly skilled architect was willing to work for less than half her market rate, as long as it was paid in folded bills. No smartphone, no Wi-Fi, no bank account in her own name. She survived entirely on paper currency and the quiet, practiced discretion of an immigrant community that understood, instinctively, and without needing it explained, exactly what it felt like to want to disappear from a powerful man's line of sight. By the 9th month, the cost of all that vigilance had started showing up in her body. She wasn't running for herself anymore. Her loose sweaters hid a roundness she tracked with cheap home pregnancy tests bought with cash from 3 different pharmacies, never the same one twice. 2 heartbeats were growing inside her, entirely disconnected from the empire they had been born to inherit, and she held off on proper medical care for as long as her own good sense would allow, eventually settling on an underfunded public clinic near the Brooklyn waterfront, registering under a name that wasn't hers. The crack in her armor, when it finally came, wasn't a mistake she made. It was a clerical accident, the kind of thing no amount of paranoia can fully guard against. The clinic needed to order a specialized pediatric breathing monitor for what was shaping up to be a high-risk twin delivery, and to expedite shipping, a local clerk attached an old, obsolete corporate billing code to the invoice. A code Zaria herself had written down years earlier on a scrap of reference paper from a project long since closed, a code she'd left behind at the clinic without thinking twice about it. 3 seconds after that invoice uploaded to the global logistics cloud, a quiet red alert lit up on a secure terminal in Seoul. The code matched a blacklisted data string that Tae-Hyun's systems had been scanning for every single millisecond for nearly a year without a single hit. He didn't ask his team to double-check the coordinates. He didn't send anyone ahead to confirm. Within 20 minutes, his private jet was taxiing onto the runway at Gimpo Airport, nose pointed straight at New York. The maternity ward at the public hospital in Brooklyn did not offer privacy. It offered something closer to survival. Walls painted a dull, peeling institutional green that had probably been chosen decades earlier for its supposed calming effect and had long since stopped calming anyone. Air thick with the smell of industrial bleach laid over a floor wax that never quite dried all the way. Beyond the door, the ordinary chaos of a Brooklyn night pressed in. Sirens tearing down Flatbush Avenue, raised voices somewhere down the hall, the constant low rattle of an overworked heater that never fully warmed the room. Zaria had learned, over 16 hours of unmedicated labor with no one's hand to hold but her own grip on the rusted bed rail, to let that noise become a kind of shield. As long as the hospital sounded chaotic and ordinary, it felt, in some superstitious corner of her exhausted mind, safe. She sat propped against 2 flat pillows now, her face drained nearly white, her dark hair damp and pressed flat against her forehead, tear tracks cut clean through the grime of a day that had asked more of her body than she'd known it had to give. She wasn't crying from the pain anymore. She was crying because she was looking down at 2 small, impossibly light bundles wrapped in thin, scratchy hospital blankets. A boy and a girl, breathing in that shallow, rapid rhythm newborns have, tiny fists batting at air they'd never felt before. For the first time in 9 months, something in her chest unclenched all the way. She had done it. She had gotten them here, into a world where they would not grow up behind armored glass and pre-map driving routes. That piece lasted exactly 40 minutes. The door didn't open. It came apart from its frame with a sudden, violent shudder, the latch tearing loose from drywall that had never been built to withstand that kind of force. The ordinary noise of the hallway didn't drift in through the gap. It was swallowed whole, replaced by a cold, total silence that Zaria recognized in her bones before she'd even consciously registered what was happening. Tae-Hyun stepped into the room looking entirely foreign to it, his tailored black suit dark with New York rain, his wool coat brushing against a trash receptacle as he moved, utterly out of place against the cheap tile and the rattling heater. He'd come without his usual security detail. He didn't need it. His eyes were bloodshot from a 14-hour flight he hadn't slept through. His jaw clenched so hard the muscle along his cheek twitched visibly, and his hands, those famously, impossibly still hands, were shaking with an emotion he had spent 30 years training himself never to let anyone see. He looked at the twins. Then he looked at her. He leaned down over the guardrail of her bed until his shadow blotted out the harsh fluorescent light overhead entirely, and he pointed one trembling finger at her face, his voice dropping into a low, jagged growl that seemed to vibrate the metal bed frame itself. He demanded to know how she could have hidden his children and crossed an ocean to give birth in a place like this. A place with peeling paint and a broken latch and nurses who hadn't even noticed the door come off its hinges yet. She didn't flinch from the finger an inch from her face. She didn't call out for help. She pulled the twins tighter against her chest, and her eyes went to something hard and clear and absolutely unafraid as she looked straight through his fury to whatever was underneath it. She told him she hadn't run from his enemies, and she hadn't run from danger. She'd run from his silence. She told him she would rather raise her children in a crowded, underfunded ward where they could hear a human voice through a thin wall than in a sterile, guarded palace where their own father had become something closer to a ghost who locked the people he loved away to keep them safe. He had spent the 14-hour flight rehearsing exactly what he would say to her, a cold, final ultimatum, the kind of speech that ends a relationship and begins a custody battle fought with lawyers instead of words. He opened his mouth to deliver it. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a crumpled, multi-page document, dropping it onto her lap, right across the pink hospital blankets. It was a printed genetic data sheet, pulled directly from the hospital's own internal server by his tracking unit less than an hour before he'd broken down that door. His voice, when he spoke again, had lost every trace of fury. It had gone hollow instead, cracking under a weight that seemed to be threatening to take the whole structure of him down with it. He pointed at a row of numbers highlighted in red on the second page. He demanded to know why the sequencing for their daughter matched his bloodline with mathematical certainty, while the sequencing for their son showed a 99% paternal match to a man named Lee Young-se, the rival syndicate leader who had spent the better part of a decade trying to have Tae-Hyun's entire family killed. Zaria stared at the columns of numbers, her mind stalling out completely as it tried and failed to make any of it line up into something that could possibly be true. She had never met Lee Young-se. She had never set foot anywhere near the part of Seoul his organization operated in. The accusation was monstrous, almost absurd in its cruelty, a calculated insult clearly designed to strip her bare before whatever came next. But when she looked up at Tae-Hyun's face, she didn't find a man hunting for an excuse to destroy her. She found a man who looked, for the first time since she'd known him, genuinely and completely terrified. Some old warning, planted in him by his father decades earlier, was screaming somewhere behind his eyes that the moment your door has been found, everything you believed about your own safety becomes a lie. It was Zaria, exhausted and bleeding and running on nothing but adrenaline, who noticed it first. A small technical detail buried at the bottom of the data sheet, a digital timestamp from the hospital's electronic record system. The file hadn't been generated by any lab after her delivery. According to its own metadata, the entire data matrix had been uploaded to the hospital's local server 3 hours before she had even been wheeled into the delivery room. The realization landed on both of them at once, changing the air in the room like a sudden drop in pressure. Someone hadn't simply tracked her down. Someone had reached into the hospital's mainframe while she was still in labor, fabricated an impossible genetic contradiction out of nothing, and fed it straight to Tae-Hyun's private server, timed to land in his hands at the exact moment he was standing over his own newborn children. Whoever had built this hadn't wanted Tae-Hyun to simply find her. They had wanted him to read that paper, lose every ounce of the control that had kept him alive for 30 years, and become, in one irreversible moment, the kind of monster his father had always warned him he might be. The real trap had never been the cage Zaria escaped from. It was the man someone was trying, with surgical precision, to force Tae-Hyun to become. While the rain kept beating against the sterile glass of that Brooklyn ward, 6,000 miles away, the digital heart of Tae-Hyun's empire was running with the same quiet, lethal precision it always did. In the high-security operations hub overlooking the Han River, the lights stayed dimmed around the clock to save the eyes of technicians tracking cargo vessels across 3 oceans at once. At the center of that room, behind a bank of monitors that mapped the entire shipping infrastructure of East Asia in real time, sat a man named Jin-Woo. For 7 years, Jin-Woo had been Tae-Hyun's logistical manager, the architect of the syndicate's data pipelines, the man who translated Tae-Hyun's cold, clipped commands into flawless operational execution. He had been, by every outward measure, the perfect second-in-command. Hyper-efficient, unfailingly loyal in tone and posture, the kind of man whose corporate persona had been polished so smooth that no one in the organization had ever thought to look underneath it. What no one had bothered to look for was the quiet, methodical arithmetic running underneath that loyalty for the better part of 9 months. It hadn't started as greed, and it hadn't started as a grudge. It had started as cold, simple survival math. Months earlier, Jin-Woo had discovered Zaria's pregnancy through a medical data flag he'd quietly installed across nearly every public clinic network on the eastern seaboard of the United States. A contingency he'd built without anyone's knowledge or approval, the kind of quiet overreach that ambitious men in his position learned to disguise as diligence. When the flag confirmed twins, Jin-Woo had not felt any flicker of joy at the continuation of the bloodline he served. He'd felt the floor shift under his own future. A male heir locked the syndicate's succession permanently into Tae-Hyun's direct line. It meant that no matter how indispensable Jin-Woo made himself, no matter how flawlessly he executed every order for the rest of his working life, he would remain exactly what he had always been: useful, but ultimately replaceable, a steward of someone else's throne with absolutely no claim to it himself. So he had spent weeks engineering the tool that would eventually shatter Tae-Hyun's composure in that hospital room. A piece of digital sabotage built with the same obsessive precision Jin-Woo brought to everything. He had injected a precise set of false DNA markers, copied exactly from Lee Young-sae's own genetic profile, into the Brooklyn Hospital's electronic health record system, timed to sit there waiting hours before Zaria had even gone into labor. The plan, in Jin-Woo's mind, had been close to flawless. Tae-Hyun would see the data. The old trauma his father had instilled in him. The conviction that betrayal had to be answered instantly, and without mercy, would take over before his rational mind could intervene. A double homicide inside a public American hospital would trigger a federal investigation that would tear Tae-Hyun out of Seoul indefinitely, leaving the corporate throne sitting empty for exactly the kind of capable, loyal-seeming second-in-command who happened to already be standing right next to it. But as Jin-Woo sat watching the live telemetry feed from Tae-Hyun's private communication device, his pen stopped moving in his hand. The biometric readings built into Tae-Hyun's secure line showed something Jin-Woo hadn't planned for at all: a sudden, unexpected stabilization. Tae-Hyun's heart rate had dropped instead of spiking. The audio intercept from the room stayed dead silent for far longer than rage usually allowed. Tae-Hyun hadn't acted on instinct. He had hesitated. He was studying the timestamps. He was reading the data the way an architect reads a structure, looking for the place where it had been built wrong. Jin-Woo felt the adrenaline hit his system like a dropped wire. If Tae-Hyun traced that data injection back through even 2 layers of the network, it would lead, eventually and inevitably, to a terminal sitting 6 feet from where Jin-Woo was now gripping his own pen hard enough to bend it. He understood, with a clarity that left no room for half measures, that his window hadn't just narrowed. It had nearly closed. If Tae-Hyun confirmed the sabotage before sunrise, Jin-Woo wouldn't simply lose his position in the organization. He would lose his life before the Han River turned gold with morning light. He didn't panic in any way that would have shown on his face. He opened a separate, encrypted satellite channel, one that bypassed the main syndicate mainframe entirely and connected directly to a small, aggressive street crew he'd kept on retainer in the borough of Queens for exactly this kind of contingency. Men who weren't part of any organized hierarchy, who didn't care about bloodlines or corporate succession or any of the things that made Jin-Woo's plan elegant in his own mind. They cared about the seven-figure wire transfer that had just cleared into an offshore account none of them could trace back to a name. The instruction Jin-Woo typed into the terminal was short, and it didn't waste a single word on emotion. He didn't tell them to negotiate. He didn't tell them to take the children as leverage. He told them to storm the 7th floor of the hospital, eliminate every witness inside Incubator Room 7, and burn the local medical server room down afterward, so there would be nothing left for anyone to trace. Back in Brooklyn, the steady, rhythmic clicking of the neonatal ventilator down the hall skipped a beat as the building's secondary power grid took a small, almost imperceptible voltage drop. 3 floors below, in the parking garage, 3 unmarked utility vans sat idling in the dark, their side doors already sliding open as 12 men in heavy coats stepped out onto the concrete ramp and moved, without hurry, toward the service elevators. The same elevator Zaria had quietly studied months earlier, back when she'd thought she was only memorizing an escape route for herself. The first sign of trouble didn't come from a hospital monitor or a flashing light at the nurse's station. It came as a faint, almost imperceptible vibration in the wall directly behind Zaria's bed. Months of studying structural blueprints for a living had tuned her ears, without her ever asking for the skill, to the physical habits of buildings. The particular hum a place makes when its systems are running the way they're supposed to, and the small, wrong silences that follow when something gets cut. The steady mechanical hum of the pneumatic transit tubes, the ones that move patient files and lab samples through the building's core, had simply stopped. Somewhere in the basement, someone had manually severed the primary circuit breaker feeding the 7th floor, cutting it loose from the rest of the building's nervous system. Tae-Hyun felt the shift the same instant she did, though he couldn't have told you exactly how he knew. Whatever shock had paralyzed him over the genetic data sheet evaporated instantly, replaced by the same flat, tactical clarity that had kept him alive through 3 decades of exactly this kind of moment. He didn't waste a single second on explanation or reassurance. He simply reached down, tore the heavy steel 4-pole loose from its base in one motion, and planted his body directly between the broken door frame and the bed where the twins lay sleeping, oblivious to all of it. Zaria refused to be a passive variable in whatever equation was unfolding around her. She understood, with the same clear-eyed pragmatism that had once told a project director his budget would collapse without her lighting specs, that a standard 10x10 hospital room offered no real defense against the kind of numbers that were apparently coming up those stairwells. Clutching both twins against her chest, she told Tae-Hyun, in a sharp, urgent whisper that cut clean through the rising tension, to look at the ceiling. Directly above the incubator bay was an old emergency fire isolation hatch, a detail she'd noticed weeks earlier while quietly studying the building's historic floor plans out of nothing more than professional habit, the same instinct that made her clock every exit in every room she ever walked into. What followed wasn't loud. It wasn't chaotic in the way these things look in movies. It was 2 people who had spent a year married to entirely different kinds of danger, moving in a strange, unspoken unison neither of them had ever practiced together. Tae-Hyun used his weight and the steel pole to jam the service elevator doors down the hall, buying time, while Zaria worked a maintenance panel hidden behind the bed, manually overriding the building's automated fire safety system to drop a 3-inch slab of reinforced steel between their room and the main corridor, sealing off the 7th floor in sections, splitting whatever force was coming for them into smaller, more manageable groups instead of one overwhelming wave. When the confrontation finally reached the narrow utility stairwell, it wasn't an exchange of gunfire and shouted threats. It was quiet, and it was fast, and it was over before most of the men involved had time to understand what was happening to them. Tae-Hyun handled the threat coming up from the lower landing with the same brutal, economical precision that had built and defended an empire for 15 years, while Zaria, working the building's centralized security panel like it was just another set of blueprints, locked down every remaining exit path on the floor, trapping the rest of the crew in the basement corridors until the distant wail of police sirens finally began rising up from Flatbush Avenue. The real victory, though, wasn't one with the steel pole or the locked doors. It was one with data. Before local police could compromise the scene, or anyone could quietly make evidence disappear, Tae-Hyun's personal security unit moved fast to secure the hospital's primary physical backup drive, the one system that existed entirely offline, the one thing Jin-woo had never been able to touch from 6,000 miles away no matter how deep his access ran. The raw, uncorrupted lab data, pulled straight from hardware that had never once connected to the wider network, confirmed exactly what some quieter part of Tae-Hyun had already started to suspect the moment he'd watched Zaria's face crumple in confused, genuine shock over that printed sheet. The genetic sequencing was clean. Both twins were his. The story doesn't end in a glass tower in Gangnam, and it doesn't end in the dark, freight elevator underworld of the shipping docks either. It ends 3 weeks later, in a quiet brick brownstone on the outskirts of Brooklyn, in a room that smelled like fresh-cut timber and drafting ink instead of bleach and floor wax. The afternoon sun came through tall windows and long, warm bars across the hardwood floor. Tae-Hyun sat directly on that floor, his expensive tailored suit jacket discarded over the back of a nearby chair, his sleeves rolled up past his forearms in a way that would have seemed unthinkable to the version of him standing in that hospital doorway a month earlier. His hands, the same hands that had spent a lifetime holding weapons and signing orders that ended other men's lives, were curled with absurd, careful gentleness around the head of his newborn son, supporting it the way you'd support something you were terrified of breaking and desperate not to put down. A few feet away, his daughter lay blinking up at the ceiling from a woven basket, entirely unbothered by the quiet. There were no guards stationed outside the gate, no biometric scanners blinking at the door, no black sedans idling at the curb with no plates on the front bumper. Just the ordinary sounds of a Brooklyn street drifting faintly through an open window and the soft scratch of charcoal against paper. Zaria stood by that window with a pencil balanced between two fingers, working through a fresh set of residential blueprints spread across the sill, the same quiet focus on her face that Tae-Hyun had first noticed across a boardroom 2 years and an entire lifetime ago. She looked up at him for a long moment, taking in the sight of him sitting cross-legged on her hardwood floor in a suit that probably cost more than the brownstone's last renovation, looking more at ease than she had ever once seen him look in any room he owned outright. He looked back at her, and something in his face had settled into a stillness that had nothing defensive in it at all, not the old, controlled blankness he used to wear like armor, but something closer to actual peace. He told her, quietly, that his father had understood the world exactly backward. He'd spent his whole life believing that protecting the people you loved meant building a structure strong enough to hide them in, walls thick enough, guards numerous enough, secrets deep enough that nothing could ever reach in and take them. He understood now that it had never been about the walls at all. Real protection wasn't a cage built to keep the people you loved safely hidden away in the dark. It was having the plain, unglamorous courage to walk out of the shadows yourself and stand in the light, right next to them, where anyone could see. Outside, a city bus rattled past, ordinary and loud and entirely unconcerned with shipping lanes or genetic data sheets or empires built across 2 oceans. Inside, a newborn boy yawned in his father's hands. His sister kicked one small foot against the side of her basket, and Zaria went back to her blueprints, sketching out the shape of a life none of them had to hide from anymore. If this story kept you listening all the way to the end, let me know where you're listening from in the comments. I read far more of them than you might think, and I love seeing this community grow across the world. If you enjoyed the story, leave a like and subscribe so you never miss the next dangerous love story, shocking betrayal, or unforgettable twist. And don't leave just yet. Another incredible story is waiting for you right now. Click the video on your screen and jump straight into your next dark romance adventure. I'll meet you there.